A warlord dies, not on the front lines, not aboard his flagship, but in the jungle, torn from the sky in a fiery coffin above a remote Pacific island. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had once shattered America's illusion of safety with a single dawn strike, now died in an ambush by a squadron that shouldn't even have known where he would be. But how exactly did Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's most legendary naval strategist, fall into a trap so perfectly laid by his enemies? And what does his death reveal about the deeper war behind the war of intelligence, of code-breaking, of vengeance? Because while the world remembers the explosion of bombs on December 7th, 1941, few recall the quieter, deadlier blast on April 18th, 1943, the day the United States struck back, not just in firepower, but with cold precision. This is the story of Operation Vengeance assassination mission born from signals intelligence, carried out by brave airmen flying at the edge of their limits and concluded in the tropical canopy of Bougainville. But it's also the story of what Yamamoto's death meant for Japan, the Pacific War, and the ethical murkiness of wartime assassination. The year is 1943. The tides of war are slowly beginning to turn in the Pacific. After the catastrophic Japanese offensive that had swept across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies in the early months of the war, the United States has begun its slow island-hopping counteroffensive. Battles like Midway and Guadalcanal have bled the Imperial Navy, and American industry is roaring to life. But the war is far from over. The Japanese Navy remains deadly, and its architect, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, is still commanding its operations from the shadows, respected even by his enemies, feared by his own political allies, and adored by the Japanese public. Yamamoto is no ordinary admiral. He had studied at Harvard. He had toured American shipyards. He understood America's immense industrial power. And that understanding, ironically, is what made him so dangerous. Because Yamamoto was not a fanatic, he was a realist. He had opposed war with the United States at first. In the late 1930s, as war loomed between Japan and the Western powers, Yamamoto warned his government that victory would be impossible if the war dragged on. But when ordered to serve, he did so with fanatical precision. "I shall run wild for 6 months," he famously warned, "but I have no expectation of success thereafter." His prediction would be prophetic. In the early stages of the Pacific War, Yamamoto's daring and brilliance had stunned the Allies. He masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor, the raid on Darwin, the Indian Ocean raid, and the battle plans at Midway. And even though Midway ended in catastrophic defeat, his influence remained untouchable. To the Japanese public, he was a symbol of destiny. To the military, he was the soul of the Navy. And yet, it would be a few lines of intercepted radio code that would doom him. By early 1943, U.S. naval intelligence had made astonishing progress in cracking Japanese naval codes. The codebook, known as JN-25, had been partially decrypted, and American cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor were reading a growing number of Japanese fleet communications. On April 14, 1943, one such message was intercepted. It contained precise details of an upcoming inspection tour by Admiral Yamamoto himself, an itinerary of movements across the Solomon Islands, including times, dates, and flight plans. It was a gift from the gods of war. Rear Admiral Edwin Layton, Chief of Intelligence at the Pacific Fleet, immediately recognized the opportunity. The message stated that Yamamoto would leave Rabaul at 600 on April 18th and arrive at the airfield of Balalay at 800 sharp. He would be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, accompanied by his staff and escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The Americans now faced a dilemma that has haunted the ethics of war ever since. Should they assassinate him? This was not just any target. Yamamoto was the highest-ranking officer in the Imperial Navy. Killing him would be an act of direct decapitation. But assassinating military leaders, especially in such a targeted manner, had always tread a thin line between warfare and murder. But this was total war, and to many American commanders, Yamamoto's death would be justice served justice for Pearl Harbor, for the dead at Midway, for the lost sons of Guadalcanal. President Roosevelt approved the mission within hours. The task fell to the 13th Air Force and, more specifically, to a select group of P-38 Lightning pilots stationed in Guadalcanal. The P-38 was the only American fighter in the Pacific with the range to make the 1,000-mile round-trip mission over open ocean and engage Japanese aircraft with any chance of success. The mission was codenamed Operation Vengeance. 12 P-38s were selected. 4 would form the killer flight, responsible for taking out the bomber. The remaining 8 would provide top cover against Zero interceptors. They would have to fly at wave-top level for over 400 miles to avoid detection by Japanese radar, then time their arrival at Bougainville to intercept Yamamoto's flight within minutes of its scheduled arrival. If they were early, they'd miss him. If they were late, he'd be gone. There would be no second chance. One of the men chosen for the mission was First Lieutenant Rex T. Barbera, quiet, focused young pilot from Oregon, known for his precision and intensity in the air. He would soon make history. The morning of April 18th, 1943, dawned clear and hot. The 12 P-38s of Operation Vengeance took off from Guadalcanal shortly after 7:00 a.m., loaded with external drop tanks to extend their range. They flew low, so low that saltwater spray sometimes misted across their windscreens. Flying just 15 meters above the Pacific, the American squadron threaded between islands and clouds, hidden from Japanese spotters and radar. Inside the cramped cockpit of his twin-boomed Lightning, Rex Barber focused on his instruments. Sweat pooled beneath his flight harness. Every second of flight brought them closer to their ambush point, a kill zone near the island of Bougainville. At 9:34 a.m., the radio came alive. Bogies, 11 o'clock, high. They're emerging from the white clouds, 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, nicknamed Bettys by the Allies, escorted by 6 agile A6M0s in tight formation. The moment was here. But something was wrong. Intelligence had reported only 1 Betty, yet now there were 2. The American plan depended on targeting Yamamoto's bomber, directly crippling it with overwhelming fire before the Zeros could react. But now, with a second Betty in the mix, no one knew which plane carried the Admiral. They had seconds to decide. The killer flight, led by Captain Thomas Landfire and Lieutenant Rex Barber, split. Landfire turned toward the Betty on the left. Barber chased the one on the right. The mission's successor failure would ride on instinct. What followed was a dogfight that belonged in fiction. Landfear climbed, engaging the escorting Zeros in a head-on pass while Barber dove directly for his selected bomber. It was a desperate gamble. Barber was now alone, charging into a tightly defended formation with no backup. As he closed in, Japanese gunners opened fire. Tracers stitched the sky. Barber lined up his P-38's nose and squeezed the trigger. His 20mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns roared. The Betty shuddered under the assault, black smoke pouring from one of its engines. Inside the bomber, Admiral Yamamoto sat upright, reviewing notes for his tour. The attack came without warning. One eyewitness, Yamamoto's aide-de-camp and second bomber survivor later, recalled the violent tremble as shells tore through the aircraft. According to the Japanese investigation afterward, a single bullet likely struck Yamamoto in the head or neck. He died instantly, slumped in his seat with his ceremonial katana still by his side. Moments later, the bomber banked sharply, spiraled downward, and crashed into the dense jungle below. A column of black smoke rose from the trees. Barber pulled up, narrowly avoiding the flaming wreckage. He did not yet know it, but he had just killed the most powerful man in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The operation's tactical success was undisputed, but its deeper implications would spark debate for decades. From a military standpoint, eliminating Yamamoto was a coup. He had been the strategic mind behind every major Japanese naval operation of the war's first year. With his death, the cohesion of Japanese naval command unraveled. His successors lacked both his foresight and influence. Infighting increased, planning suffered, and morale across the fleet plummeted. But there was a cost. Targeted assassination of a specific office, especially one whose movements were tracked via secret code-breaking, raised difficult ethical questions. The success of the operation meant the Japanese would now suspect their codes had been compromised. And although the Americans tried to disguise the origin of their intelligence suggesting a reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the bomber, the truth was eventually deduced. Japan changed its naval codes shortly after Yamamoto's death. While U.S. cryptographers soon caught up, the temporary blackout cost the Allies valuable insights during a critical phase of the war. Then there was the moral dimension. Some commanders fear that targeting individuals for assassination, even during war, would set a precedent. Others argue that Yamamoto was a legitimate military target actively commanding operations, and his death was no different than sinking a flagship. Rex Barber himself never dwelled on such questions. To him, it was a mission known executed with discipline and precision. But another layer of controversy surrounded the mission. Who actually shot down Yamamoto's plane? Both Barber and Landfire claimed the kill. For decades, their duel over credit became a bitter dispute. Landfire wrote articles. Barber remained largely quiet. But post-war Japanese accounts, as well as U.S. mission debriefs and ballistic evidence, heavily favored Barber's version. It was his gunfire that brought down the first Betty. It was his tracer fire that likely ended Yamamoto's life. And yet, it would take until the year 2000 for Barber's home state of Oregon to officially recognize him as Yamamoto's killer. The U.S. Air Force never formally amended the records. Even in death, Yamamoto had managed to divide his enemies. In Tokyo, news of Yamamoto's death was met with stunned disbelief. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost its most iconic leader. His state funeral drew hundreds of thousands, and Emperor Hirohito himself broke protocol to attend. Newspapers published tributes. Naval officers wept openly in mess halls. On radio broadcasts, his voice was replayed in memorial calm, resolute, almost prophetic. Because, in many ways, Yamamoto had been a reluctant war leader. He had opposed the tripartite pact with Nazi Germany. He had warned to the point of resignation against going to war with the United States. His famous remark before Pearl Harbor still echoed in military circles. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And now the giant was very much awake. The psychological blow of his assassination reverberated across the Imperial Navy. It came at a moment of already mounting stress. The Solomon Islands campaign was draining Japan's resources. The carrier losses at Midway had left a gap in strike capability, and now, without Yamamoto, Japan's strategic outlook darkened further. Yamamoto's successor, Admiral Manechi Koga, lacked his predecessor's charisma and decisiveness. Infighting among staff officers increased. Inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy, which Yamamoto had worked tirelessly to temper, resumed with fresh bitterness. But no one felt Yamamoto's death more deeply than Matome Ugaki, his loyal chief of staff. Ugaki had been aboard the second Betty bomber. Thrown into the sea by the explosion and wounded, he survived by clinging to wreckage with 2 other crewmen until they were rescued. The physical scars healed. The emotional ones never did. Ugaki's wartime diaries, discovered after Japan's surrender, are some of the most vivid personal documents of the Pacific War. In them, he wrestled with guilt for having survived the attack that killed his closest friend and mentor. Again and again, he expressed sorrow, shame, and a relentless sense of unfinished duty. He remained in uniform, rising to vice admiral, and when Japan's defeat became inevitable in August 1945, Ugaki made a fateful decision. On August 15th, hours after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Ugaki donned his full-dress uniform. At an airfield on Kyushu, he posed for a final photograph, then boarded a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber as an observer without a trained pilot's license and set off on a final kamikaze mission. He left no formal will, only a note that read, "If possible, I wish to join Admiral Yamamoto in death." His aircraft was never heard from again. The death of Isoroku Yamamoto marked more than the end of a man. It symbolized the beginning of the end for Japan's naval supremacy. His assassination did not change the tactical situation overnight, but it accelerated decay. Japan's ability to coordinate large-scale operations already hampered by resource shortages now faced a leadership vacuum. Planning became reactionary. Innovation stalled, morale plummeted. Worse, Yamamoto's death validated for the United States the value of precision decapitation operations, a controversial concept at the time. For the Allies, Operation Vengeance became the first modern example of targeted military assassination. It would not be the last. It also highlighted the crucial power of signals intelligence. The entire operation had been made possible by codebreaking, specifically by the U.S. Navy's ability to read Japanese JN-25 naval ciphers. The knowledge of Yamamoto's flight came not from spies or satellites but from intercepted radio traffic. That posed a dilemma: how to act on such knowledge without revealing the capability. By executing the ambush at long range and framing it as an opportunistic interception, the Americans gambled that the Japanese would not suspect their codes had been cracked. The gamble worked, but only temporarily. Within weeks, the Japanese changed their encryption systems. For a time, the Americans lost their edge. In military intelligence circles, the debate over use or protect, whether to act on code breaking at the risk of exposure, remains a strategic conundrum to this day. And finally, Yamamoto's death created a symbolic shift in the narrative of the Pacific War. In December 1941, he had been the face of triumph, the brilliant admiral who humbled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. By April 1943, his death symbolized a turning tide. The sleeping giant was now fully awake, methodically dismantling the empire that had once dared strike him in his slumber. In the final accounting, Yamamoto's assassination leaves behind not just military consequences, but profound historical ironies. He was a warrior who did not want war. He warned his country against overreach, knowing well that America's industrial might could not be matched. And yet, it was he who orchestrated Pearl Harbor's very act that doomed his nation to total war. He once studied at Harvard. He visited Washington. He admired American culture. Some of his aides said he would hum jazz tunes in the privacy of his cabin. And yet, he became the symbol of America's most hated enemy. In chasing strategic perfection, Yamamoto may have written his own tragic arc. And in assassinating him, America proved that even the most brilliant tactician is not immune to fate. Because when the Pacific skies burned with fire on April 18th, 1943, it wasn't just a man who fell, it was the illusion of invincibility. The echoes of Operation Vengeance reverberated long after the last bullet was fired. In the immediate aftermath, the United States military hailed the mission as a triumph of intelligence, courage, and precision flying. President Roosevelt was reportedly stunned by the success. Admiral Chester Nimitz approved the awards. Hollywood, always hungry for heroes, began crafting scripts that romanticized the daring intercept. In classrooms and barracks across America, the name Yamamoto was taught not as a strategist, but as a man who got what he deserved. But the legacy of his death is not so simple. In Japan, the loss of Admiral Yamamoto triggered a deep crisis of confidence in the military hierarchy. He had been, by far, the most admired and competent commander. More importantly, he had been a unifying figure respected across both naval and army branches, an increasingly rare status in the faction-riven Imperial High Command. Without Yamamoto, fractures deepened. His successor, Admiral Koga, lacked his political deftness and struggled to bridge rivalries. His tenure would be short-lived. He died in a plane crash in March 1944. Admiral Sonwemu Toyota took over, but by then, the momentum was irretrievably lost. Japan had already ceded the initiative in the Central and South Pacific. Carrier strength was depleted. Oil supplies dwindled. Training standards collapsed. Strategically, Yamamoto's death removed the one man who might have restructured Japanese naval thinking. He had understood that war with the United States had to be swifter, not fought at all. He had pushed for carrier warfare when many of his peers still clung to the cult of the battleship. He had promoted pilot training, logistics, and long-range planning. In his absence, Japan fell back on increasingly desperate tactics. The kamikaze attacks that would devastate the U.S. Navy at Okinawa, Yamamoto had opposed such ideas as tactically unproductive and morally corrosive. The ill-fated battles of Leyte Gulf, in which much of the remaining Japanese fleet was annihilated, they were conducted without the strategic coordination that Yamamoto might have enforced. As American historian H.P. Wilmot later remarked, in killing Yamamoto, the Americans removed Japan's most formidable thinker and spared her from the self-critique she most desperately needed. For Rex Barber, the man whose machine guns had likely ended Yamamoto's life, there was no champagne toast or triumphant speech. He returned to base quietly, grounded by fuel limitations, and wrote a brief combat report. His wingman, Thomas Landfire Jr., claimed the kill sparking a decades-long controversy over who truly shot down the admiral. The U.S. military awarded both men the Navy Cross, but Barber, known among his peers for his humility, never sought personal fame. For much of his life, he said only that he had done his duty. It was only decades later, through careful review of gun camera footage, survivor testimonies, and aircraft positions, that military historians and official U.S. assessments credited Barber with the decisive kill. Even then, he resisted the hero label. He passed away in 2001 at the age of 84, quietly, surrounded by family. At his funeral in Oregon, there were no military flyovers or media blitz. But those who knew him understood the weight he had carried for 6 decades. Because Rex Barber had killed a legend. And legends don't fall quietly. In post-war Japan, Isoroku Yamamoto's image underwent a transformation. During the war, he had been lionized as the architect of early naval victories. After the war, in the rubble of Hiroshima and the silence of surrender, his legacy became more complex. Some praised his foresight. Others blamed him for Pearl Harbor. In political circles, he was alternately viewed as a tragic realist or a loyal instrument of militarism. But among historians, one thing became clear. Yamamoto was a man torn between duty and reason. He once wrote to a colleague, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for the first 6 months. But I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." The words, penned before Pearl Harbor, would prove prophetic. Midway came at the 6th month. After that, the tide turned. Yamamoto had made his peace with contradiction. His loyalty to the emperor outweighed his private doubts. In the end, he accepted war as an obligation, not a choice. But that doesn't make him any less culpable. He masterminded an attack that killed over 2,400 Americans in a single morning. He helped plunge the Pacific into a conflict that would consume tens of millions of lives. And he used his strategic genius in service of a war he knew could not be won. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The most brilliant Japanese naval mind of the 20th century spent his final years orchestrating a war effort he believed was doomed. Operation Vengeance is often taught in history classes as a tactical success, a neat tale of intelligence, planning, and precision. But it also invites an enduring question, one that haunts generals and analysts to this day. What happens when you kill your enemy's best mind? Does it shorten the war? Or does it make the chaos worse? Will the Pacific War have ended differently, perhaps sooner, perhaps with fewer casualties had Yamamoto lived long enough to push for peace talks or surrender? Or would his survival have only prolonged the bloodshed, lending credibility to a lost cause? There are no easy answers, only the lingering smoke over Bougainville, the radio crackle of target down, and the knowledge that, in war, even a perfect kill may leave behind 1,000 unresolved ghosts. Like, comment, and subscribe to Legacy Files for more forgotten stories of history's deadliest crossroads.